The crimes and the videos are horrific. Hate crimes against Asian and Pacific Islander Americans are up 150% in 2020 compared to the year before. I spoke one-on-one with a friend and former colleague, Dr. Timothy Fong, professor of ethnic studies at Sacramento State.
Well, I think it's important to understand that this is not just a new phenomenon. This actually is a long-term historical experience of anti-Asian violence. It comes and goes, depend on different times of either economic crisis or economic tough times. In this case, COVID-19, along with economic difficulties that many people are facing. Some of the most ardent anti-Asian sentiments coming from the highest offices of the land. And in the case of the president and many members of his party, and it continues even after President Trump is gone. In California, one of the earliest Supreme Court cases was a case called People versus Hall, shortly after California became a state. And the California Supreme Court ruled that the testimony of a Chinese man against a white man was inadmissible in court. And in this case, it involved a Chinese man who witnessed a murder. And the assailant was a white male, but the Chinese man's testimony was not allowed in court. And what is important here, denying Chinese ability to testify, also basically joined Native Americans and African Americans who also were not allowed to testify in court against whites in California. This is in 1854. Of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a national law, prohibited immigration of Chinese laborers. This law was the first law to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. I mean, and then it came up again fairly recently with the Muslim ban. And so, history keeps repeating itself in very different ways. There was an Immigration Act of 1917, which banned to this country undesirables. Basically, it was a period of anti-immigrant sentiment. Undesirables that included illiterates, imbeciles, insane people, and homosexuals, basically trying to curb immigration to the United States. But one section of the law specifically designated an Asian barred zone, which people simply couldn't immigrate. And it included much of Asia and the Pacific Islands. So you see a history. And then, of course, Japanese American internment during World War II, which was forced relocation and incarceration of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom on the West Coast, and 62% of those Japanese Americans who were interned were actually American citizens.
Yeah. So we have a pretty dark history when it comes to Asian American Pacific Islander citizens. Mm-hmm. We are talking about American citizens, and I just wonder why we haven't progressed or learned from all of our mistakes in the past. And you just see it now. And I'm of an age, you get older and you think, why is this still the same? Or I don't know if it's worse, Tim. Sometimes I think that we just know more about, mm-hmm. It's more evident because of social media, the cameras are everywhere, which I always thought that was a good thing. Mm-hmm. It is, but on the other hand, it's hard to watch it all. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know some people just want to hide their head in the sand, but I'm rambling.
But it's unfortunate to put the head in the sand, because the reality, there is a long history. There are various times when the anti-Asian sentiment and violence, in the 1980s, when there was a backlash against import of Japanese cars. In Detroit in 1982, two auto workers killed a man named Vincent Chin, who was not even Japanese, but they didn't know the difference and they didn't care. And he was beaten to death with a baseball bat. There have been several other cases, even locally. In 1989, there was a Stockyard schoolyard shooting. I don't know if you remember that at all, but it was a man with an assault rifle dressed in camouflage went to an elementary school and fired over 100 rounds with a assault rifle, and killed 5 children. The youngest was 6, the oldest was 9, and injured 31 others.
Was he targeting
Yes,
Asian Americans?
absolutely, and he actually went to that school. The perpetrator went to that school, and it initially wasn't called a hate crime. Ironically enough, even though it was targeting, obviously Asian people, and they wouldn't know anyways because he killed himself before the police captured him. But it wasn't not declared as a hate crime until the Attorney General's office did an investigation and declared it a hate. Just fairly recently, in 2011, 2 Sikh men in Elk Grove were taking their afternoon walk and were shot and killed. Been solved.
Someone knows something, and they're just not talking.
Well, the thing about anti-Asian violence is it's so random. And in the case of Atlanta, these women didn't do anything. I mean, neither the children in Stockton schoolyard, neither they were, because they were Asian, because they looked different, because they were seen as foreigners. They were seen as threats, even though they were seen 2 older men and young children.
Well, some of the violence in San Francisco has been against the elderly.
There is an organization, Stop AAPI Hate, which has been collecting data on this, and women are the victims 2.5 times more often.
Has the attack in Atlanta been called a hate crime? Because I heard that there were saying that it wasn't a hate crime, which that's another reason. It's like, by God, have we learned anything?
Not at this statutes. I mean, but the reality, it was xenophobic, it was racist, and it was misogynistic. I mean, that is clearly the case. There are guidelines, because the perpetrator, the suspect, does not acknowledge that he was a racist. But you can still be a racist and just not acknowledge it. And there's plenty of examples of that, things people say that are absolutely racist, and they would never admit they're racist.
Right. My one-on-one with Dr. Timothy Fong, Professor of Ethnic Studies at Sacramento State, continues in part 2. The entire podcast of our one-on-one conversation is posted now. Please share and subscribe.